Yeah, I'm Ben Goertzel, and like many of the people talking in this session, theorizing and speculating about consciousness is not really my primary line of work. I mean, most of what I'm concerned with is trying to build artificial general intelligence systems. And in the course of thinking about building AGI systems, of course the topic of consciousness comes up frequently enough, because one of the things you would like your AGI systems to do is to display and hopefully experience consciousness in a similar way to how people do, and ultimately maybe going beyond human consciousness. So what I'm going to talk about now is how would you characterize or measure or understand whether a system has consciousness in the same sense that human beings do. And my primary motive for thinking about this topic has been thinking about in what sense could an OpenCog system, or say one of Josha's micro-sized systems, in what sense could an AGI system that you built be said to be conscious? How would you measure its degree of consciousness? How would you think about its degree of consciousness? But the ideas I'm going to discuss are equally relevant to people concerned with measuring or understanding consciousness in human brains or other kinds of systems. And this is a large and deep topic, and my thoughts on it are fairly wide-ranging. So, of course, I'm only going to be able to give a sort of capsule summary of my line of thinking in this talk. If you search online in Google for my name and the title, Characterizing Human-like Consciousness, you'll find a 23-page paper which this is based on, and the 6-page paper in the conference proceedings is sort of an extended abstract of that. And I apologize for the slides, which consist of a few bullet lists cut and pasted out of the paper during the last 15 minutes, since I at the last minute decided to give this talk now instead. I hadn't made the presentation yet, but it just gives me more reason to start my own face instead. So one of the points I'm going to make is that I think to understand human-like consciousness, the sense in which people are conscious, there's not really going to be any one golden measure or formula to look at. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects that I think are key to human-like consciousness. I mean, one is that it's a nonlinear dynamical phenomenon. You can sort of think of a conscious state as an attractor in a certain way. There's attention involved. I mean, you're focusing energetic and informational resources on the things in your focus of conscious attention. I'm a big fan of Bernie Barr's global workspace model, which looks at the dynamics of interplay between the attentional focus and the rest of the mind. I do think that information integration, for example, as highlighted by Tononi, is part of the story, and modeling of the self, a certain type of reflection, is also critical. And so there's a lot of different aspects. Now, I think we have to consider them all together, which is a mess, but I think that's just the way it is. Just like, as many of you know, I think human-like mind architecture is kind of a mess. It's something that evolved opportunistically. It's not necessarily that elegant. I mean, it's a particular system, just like the liver, the lungs, and the intestines and so on are a particular system. And I think human-like consciousness is also a particular system with particular properties that has evolved in a certain way. Now, I'll confess a certain bias here up front, although this is not going to be the focus of my talk. I mean, in terms of the philosophy of consciousness and the qualia problem and the hard problem of consciousness and all that, I tend personally towards some form of panpsychism. And I tend to think that is pretty much the only consistent perspective on consciousness. And I think, although Max Tegmark didn't call it that, he was sort of leaning in that direction in some way in his talk earlier, saying that dualism kind of doesn't make sense. When you try to boil down, like, what would it mean for there to be some conscious mind realm up here and some physical system realm down here? Like, how do they talk to each other? What's the interface like? When you really dig into that, it's very hard to formalize that in a meaningful way. So then you come up with the idea that in essence, consciousness, whatever it is, has to be somehow immanent in the physical universe. And of course, philosophers have written a huge amount about this from different perspectives, and we can discuss that later. But I'm going to now review a few well-known properties of human-like consciousness. I mean, one key property is it seems to be a graded characteristic. It's not all or nothing. Like right now, I'm a lot more conscious than I was yesterday due to the lack of sleep after arriving from Hong Kong. And even though I'm sort of a panpsychist, my guess is when we finally bottom out how to measure consciousness, it will come out that, for example, Cosmo there is more conscious than the average worm. Maybe a worm does a little bit at least.
The average worm.
The exceptional worm, yeah, I would guess even there, right? So there's a notion of degrees of consciousness in many senses, right? Like now I'm vaguely conscious of, say, my feet, but I'm more conscious of my voice and the people I'm looking at. So consciousness is a graded rather than a binary characteristic. There's also a notion of states of consciousness that somehow we need to take into account, which goes back to at least explicitly recognized by William James, who, I mean, what he said is, our ordinary waking consciousness is just one special type of consciousness, and all around it are potential forms of consciousness that are very different. And this is one of the insights from the psychology of consciousness. If you look in the work of Charles Tart, for example, wrote a large volume enumerating various states of consciousness that people get into. And these are empirical facts about human-like consciousness that need to be taken into account. Now, there's also a lot known in cognitive psychology just about the structure of human consciousness. I mean, the structure of working memory is reasonably well understood now. So, I mean, we have essentially special caches for phonology and for visual data and for our episodic memory. And these are critical to our own conscious experience. I mean, not every system would have to be that way. You look at the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketch pad as characterized in Bagley's classic model of working memory. These are basically caches for speech and vision, because we are creatures that do speech and vision. You can imagine another kind of intelligence would say a cache for smell instead, or a hash table type cache for mathematical formulas if you had a theorem proving AI or something. So human-like consciousness is characterized by these specific efficiency optimizations that have evolved in the human brain. One of the more impressive attempts to model human-like consciousness, I think, is what's called dynamic global workspace theory. And I'd encourage you to look up that paper, look up Bernard Barr's and that title. This is a quite detailed neurophysiological / cognitive science model of how consciousness works, and it ties in empirical experiments on human consciousness with various measurements of different regions of the brain. I can't summarize it fully in a couple sentences, but they model how the focus of attention broadcasts information across the rest of the brain into the parts of the brain corresponding to the unconscious mind, which then does some processes and sends things back into the conscious focus. And they pinpoint which parts of the brain seem to be involved in this process. And this is then tied in, for example, with Stan Franklin's LIDA cognitive architecture, which we've probably heard presented at previous BICO conferences. There's a notion here of the cognitive cycle, frequently iterated, where, say, 10 hertz roughly, they pinpointed there's this cycling between the focus of attention and the other parts of the brain. And another way of looking at this, which has been around a long time, this is a quote from Alan Combs, a psychologist friend of mine. You can look at that as a nonlinear dynamical process. And this cycle is actually, this cognitive cycle is moving the nonlinear dynamical system of the brain into certain attractors. And you can look at different states of consciousness as different classes of attractors that the nonlinear dynamical system of the brain gets into. Attention, of course, is a key aspect of it. I mean, there's focusing of energetic resources. What's in your focus of conscious attention is probably getting more of the brain's energy than other stuff. And there's probably more information processing going on there as well. Self-modeling is a key part of it. I would encourage everyone to look at the book. This is from 10 years ago now, 2004, by Thomas Metzinger, called being no one, which is the classic work of neurophilosophy. And he looks at how the phenomenal self, the idea that we are this self, this unified being, interacting with the rest of the world, how that emerges and is built by the brain, largely by studying how that capacity is impaired in some people with various neurological defects. So yeah, when someone said in an earlier talk, basically from a cosmic sense, all we can know is I am, right? Actually, what Metzinger would argue is the I is a sort of cognitive construct, so all you can say is am. And then, of course, am is present tense, which is an arbitrary feature of English. Why not was or will be? The linear flow of time is in a sense a cognitive construct as well. If you look at Julian Barber's book, The End of Time. So then you're just left with not even am, maybe om, I don't know. But the construction of the self-model is a key thing that human consciousness does. And it's interesting to think about to what extent that would be the case of non-human consciousness. For example, Francis Heylighen and his colleagues at the Global Brain Institute at Free University of Brussels, they talk about a global brain spanning the whole world. Like, to what extent is the global computing and communication network of people, computers, mobile phones, AI systems like Google's, to what extent is this global brain an intelligent system or a conscious system? That's interesting. The whole totality of human beings and computers and everything interacting together may be in a way more intelligent than each of us as an individual, but it's a different kind of intelligence if so, and if it has a consciousness, it might be a quite different kind. Maybe the global brain is a kind of consciousness without so much of a self-model as a human being has. I mean, the reason we have a self-model is because we evolved to control this body, which has to preserve itself from being eaten and so forth. A global brain is a kind of information system that doesn't have that same kind of evolutionary heritage to fight for survival. The nature of its phenomenal self may end up being quite different. We have integrated information theory, which we've heard a bit about already from Max Tegmark's talk, which is summarized very simplistically, the idea that consciousness is correlated with states where the different parts of the system are all processing information in a heavily integrated way. So there's a lot of information occurring on the emergent level, as opposed to the information being siloed in individual components in the system. And there's been a lot of debate about this. If you look, for example, at Scott Aronson's blog, there's a lot of discussion of that, including some back and forth between Aronson and Tononi himself. I mean, I think most of the discussion ends up pertaining to whether integrated information is a necessary and sufficient condition for consciousness, or is it merely a necessary condition? And I think that there's a reasonable argument that integrated information is a necessary condition. I mean, whether Tononi's math for summarize integrated information is the right way to do it is a whole other question. I'm not sure about that one way or the other, but conceptually, it seems like consciousness does have to do with integration of information. But I don't think that alone is enough. And that brings us back to my hypothesis that you really want to look at multiple aspects to characterize human-like consciousness. So if you think about it sort of panpsychically, like, okay, everything is conscious in some way, but a worm is maybe less conscious than a person, and also has a very different kind of conscious awareness. The global brain may be conscious in some way, but has a very different kind of conscious awareness than people. Then the question becomes not how do you characterize consciousness versus non-consciousness. The question becomes how do you characterize human-like consciousness? What are the cognitive and neural correlates of human-like consciousness in particular? And I'm conceiving that fairly broadly. So say an OpenCog AI system, like what I'm trying to build with my colleagues, we're not trying to emulate the human brain in any kind of great detail, but it's still, roughly speaking, a human-like system. I mean, it's supposed to control a body. It has a short-term memory, a long-term memory. It's supposed to see and move things and so forth. It's not a global brain, and it's not a worm, for example. So I think if you're trying to emulate or achieve human-like consciousness, then the various aspects I've reviewed from the excellent work of other people seem to isolate important parts of it: integrated information, self-modeling a global workspace, focusing of energetic and informational resources, some nonlinear dynamical representation. So if I had to make some kind of quantitative measure of consciousness, it would be a fairly messy one. I mean, I would look at the multiple aspects I just put on the previous slide, try to measure how much each one is present in the system, which is complicated. I mean, how do you measure how much of a global workspace there is? How much information focusing there is? There'd be a lot of arbitrary choices in quantifying each of those. You'd make some weighted average of all those things, and then look at how much that is manifested in what the system is doing. And that comes out quite complex and messy, but to me it's a similar problem to how do you define how human-like an AI system is? I mean, there's a lot of different factors to weigh there. It's not really such a simple thing. Now, I've bypassed the qualia problem to a significant degree here, so for the last minute or so, before I open it up for a little discussion, I'll give you my completely out there and quasi-scientific speculation about how we might actually address the qualia problem, which I think is a genuine problem. I mean, I don't think you need to solve that problem to build an AI system any more than you need to solve all the problems of the philosophy of space and time to build a clock or a spaceship or something. But I do think still there's a genuine and deep problem there in the disjunction between our subjective experience of consciousness, of being aware, and the neural and cognitive correlates of consciousness, which is what I've sought to approximately enumerate here. So I wonder what will happen. You know, we probably all saw in the news in the last couple of weeks, people have made some primitive progress toward sharing information directly, brain to brain. Now, what happens when that gets more advanced? And you can actually wire brains into each other and share subjective experiences actually by brain-to-brain wiring while describing your common experience that you're sharing, while actually monitoring the brain with some better brain imaging instruments than we have now. I mean, is it possible that by some kind of scientifically mediated, technologically mediated, direct sharing of subjective experience, along with empirical study of what's happening in the brain at that time, can we somehow get to some real understanding of how the qualia combine with these various correlates on the cognitive and neural level? I mean, I don't know, but that seems like a new sort of frontier, which is different than what we're doing now. But I think that the qualia problem is at the border of philosophy and science. I don't think you can resolve it by this sort of thing. But I think that in order to pragmatically measure sort of how conscious a person seems to be, or how much consciousness one's AGI system has, the qualia problem doesn't necessarily have to be solved either, although it's an interesting thing to explore. So yeah, I mean, this way of looking at consciousness is sort of less satisfying and more boring than an approach that says, like, this one formula of information integration is the equation of consciousness. But I think human-like intelligence and human-like consciousness are both kind of messy and multifactorial if you really look at what they are. And kind of following up on some of Josh's comments earlier, I mean, it's nice to use physics and mathematics and pure science to find insights. And on the other hand, psychologists have been studying consciousness from a variety of perspectives for a long time and have uncovered various things of some value. So I think it's important to look at consciousness from a variety of different perspectives, out of a number of different disciplines, and try to get some sort of overall integrated understanding of it. I guess we have a few minutes for questions.